All right. How do you feel about failure? I mean, I just said this word and I was preparing for this interview and like I felt like something go down my spine, right? I think we have this
It's
visceral reaction when we hear the
it's
word failure,
true.
we just want to, right, avoid it at
Yeah.
all costs. But my guest today has a completely different lens. And I have to tell you, her work and her book that we're going to talk about has really helped me see failure in a different light. So I'm so excited for this conversation. My guest is Amy Edmondson, who is a professor of leadership and management at Harvard Business School. She's the author of 7 books, including her latest best-selling book, which I was just telling her I dog-eared and underlined all over. Here it is. It's called The Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well. Oh my goodness. So that's what we're going to talk about. Amy, I'm so happy you're here. Thanks so much for being on Reinventability.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
All right, let's dive right in. We failure, we go, "Arr!" I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. I've had 4 companies. I've launched books. And still I'm like, oh, and yet you talk about failure as a good
Yeah.
thing. Let's just
Well,
dive in. Yeah,
okay, let's dive
go.
in. So I too have an immediate negative emotional reaction to failure, to the word. I'm not sure it's the word, it's the idea, right?
Mhm.
It's I mean, I want to succeed, not fail. And I think to be successful, we have to overcome. I mean, it's not that we'll maybe ever drive that reaction fully outside of ourselves, but we have to learn how to manage it, how to overcome it. And my premise is that if we can get more thoughtful about the different kinds of failure,
Mhm.
it's easier for us to get over that spontaneous emotional aversion that we have.
Yes, and I'd love for you to talk about that. One of the things that I've been thinking about ever since I first read it in your book about this idea of intelligent failure that you talk about. So can you talk about what is intelligent failure? Because
Sure.
when I read that, I was like, oh,
Yeah.
that's an interesting way to think about it.
Sure, it sounds like an oxymoron, right?
Yeah.
But so the title of the book, Right Kind of Wrong, that refers to the intelligent failures, right? It's still disappointing. So a failure, I define a failure as an undesired outcome.
Mm.
And there are 3 kinds, but the intelligent kind are the undesired outcomes that are the result of a thoughtful foray into new territory. And I identify 4 criteria. Right. First, it is new territory. You can't just look up the answer or the recipe on the internet and use it. If you can, please do. Number 2, it's in pursuit of a goal, and you're trying to get somewhere. You're trying to accomplish something. Number 3, you've done your homework. This isn't about just throwing darts at the wall. It's you've talked to experts or you've talked to friends. You have good reason to believe that what you're about to try might work. You understand it might not, but it's a reasonable experiment. And number 4, the failure, if it happens, should be no bigger than necessary to give you
Mm.
the new experience or learning that you need. And so when you have those criteria met, you can rightly think of the failure as valuable new data, because it is. It brings you new knowledge that you simply could not have gotten any other way.
I think to me, Amy, and I have really been talking about this concept with the leaders that I mentor. I'm running this reinventability accelerator right now where everyone is launching something new career, new business, new part of their life. And this was a key insight that I shared with them in that when you try something and you think about it and it's pursued as goal and it doesn't work, that's fantastic. You're going to learn. Do I want to do it? Do I not? So I think it's so powerful. So just so we have the framework, what are the other kinds of
Yeah.
failures? So that's the intelligent
Yeah.
failure. Tell
That's
us
the
about the
intelligent
rest.
failure. And that's the only one that we really should celebrate or be happy about. The other 2 are both to varying degrees preventable and to varying degrees are more wasteful than productive. And they are basic failures and complex failures. And a basic failure is one with a single cause, usually human error, but I suppose it might be, a catastrophic hurricane or something that led to a failure of some event. But it's very simple. I mean, you don't have to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what happened. It's clear. I you know we were in familiar territory. We were doing something we knew how to do. Something happened that led to the failure. those happen in life. Of course, they will keep happening, but they aren't worth celebrating. They're still worth learning from, but they don't give us really brand new, valuable learning. Complex failures are those failures that are multi-causal. They have a handful of factors interacting in just the wrong way to produce a bad outcome. And they're the kinds of failures where any one of the factors on their own wouldn't have led to the failure. It was the interaction effect that came together.
One of the examples of how to possibly prevent that is one of my favorite stories in your book. It was about the Toyota plant. And I'm forgetting, what's the name of the cord that they
Endon
pull?
cord. It's the
That's
endon
right.
cord.
Can you talk about that? Because I think this also really connects to, well, how do we prevent those systematic complex let's say if you're a
Yeah.
leader on a team
Yep.
or an entrepreneur running a company.
Kind of interesting. So the end-on cord is quite literally a cord, like on old-fashioned buses, where you used to pull the cord to, to signal to the
Yeah.
driver that this was your stop. So it's a cord that goes horizontally above the assembly line, and any team member at any time can pull that cord if they see something that concerns them. It might be an actual problem, a quality problem, or it might be just something that could become a quality
Mm-hmm.
problem, something that doesn't look quite right. And so the andon cord actually helps us prevent both basic and complex failures. It prevents basic failures because if you see just, some small error or some small deviation from optimal process, you can pull the cord, and that will, many people, if they've heard of the andon cord, they think that's, you pull the cord, you stop the line. It's actually not true. When you pull the cord, you signal to a team leader who immediately will come over and say, "What do you see, Natalie?" And then you'll say, "Not quite sure about this." 11 out of 12 pulls of the andon cord are in fact not an actual quality problem. They're a potential problem that the two team members looking together will sort of figure it out in time to not have to not have to stop the line.
Yeah.
And so so that's, we just avoid we first of all, we take all the low hanging fruit off of quality problems. We don't want to have cars sitting in the area where they're imperfect and they need to be we need to come in and fix them. Devices like the andon cord can also prevent complex failures, because sometimes you get a failure where there's a small deviation over here and maybe a small deviation over there, and neither one of them would cause a problem. But when they came together, they'd cause a problem. So by inviting people to speak up quickly and early, even when they have enormous doubt about whether there's a real problem, you shine a light, on the potential risk
Mm-hmm.
factor, the potential failure. And most of the time, you can, in fact, prevent those failures, especially in highly familiar territories.
Yeah. You know what? As I was reading that part, and, I've read about your work in psychological safety a lot, right? Creating an environment where actually we feel that we can pull the proverbial cord and go to our manager and say,
Exactly.
and I just want to share with you, Amy, I ate a lot of humble pie because, I spent 20 years leading teams and tech companies and startups I founded. And I was thinking back and I was trying to be as kind as I could towards myself, because we do want to approach learning with self-compassion. And I realized that even though I told my teams often, and I ran tech teams, right? So a lot of bugs that I would tell them, like, hey, if something is up, let me know if you think we're heading in the wrong direction. So I encouraged them to pull the cord. But I think where I went wrong often, and I'd love for you to talk about this because you talk about how important it is the way that the leader responds when someone actually pulls it. Because I think what I did, and I love learning from my own mistakes, which is part of failure, right? Part of the growth is I would get alarmed, right? Even if it was a small thing, I would be someone who's like, because I was so committed to the customer, I'd be like, oh my God, 5 alarm fire. Or if it was a small thing, I'd be like, oh, I'd get annoyed. Like, can't you fix that?
Right.
And I think over time, not 100%, but kind of what that created is if it's small stuff, don't bring it up. And then small stuff adds up. So can you talk about the importance of how leaders respond. And when I say leader, I mean head of a family, head of a soccer team, head of a team, head of a business. I think those are all teams, right?
Absolutely. Even head of a team, even head of a production team in a business, right? So, yes, I mean, we human beings are kind of hardwired and then deeply socialized to be quite sensitive to power and authority. So when, the reactions of leaders are magnified in our
Yes.
heads. And so, if you've heard the messaging from your company, yep, bring the bad news forward or speak up with the dissenting view, but you are greeted with negative facial expressions or maybe worse, actual displays of emotion or even anger, then it won't happen again. Right. So as a leader, and again, as you say, a leader of a family, a leader of any entity, you must train yourself
Mm.
to have a productive, learning oriented response to bad news, dissenting views, mistakes, failures, and the like. And a productive response isn't all Pollyanna, nicey nicey, right? A productive response is, thank you so much for that clear line of sight. How can I help? Right? It's deliberately forward looking. You
Hmm.
resist the temptation to ask the very good question, but you should ask it later, which is, how did that happen? Again,
Yes.
an important question, but not now. Like your initial response must be, oh, good, a gem, right? You have problem solving is a team sport
Yeah.
and in, complex organizations. So when you make it a positive experience, because it isn't naturally a positive experience for people to come forward with concerns, questions, ideas, then you are building in this habit of learning, and it's
Yeah.
so important.
Amy, as you're talking, and I'm sure you made this connection, but I didn't until this moment in thinking about this. The way that you're describing that the leader should respond is also how we should respond when we make a mistake and failure, right?
Oh, that's such a good point. I think that's implied in my, sort of the self-awareness chapter, but I'm not sure I've put that together too, because it's the productive response. That really is the essence of, what I call to stop, challenge, choose. It's kind of pause, make sure you don't overreact to the other, but don't overreact to yourself either. Don't start beating yourself up for things that go wrong. Things will go wrong. You will make mistakes. You will get it wrong. So pause, right? And sort of say, okay, this is worth looking at. What does it imply going forward?
Hmm. And to your point, I also think, so much as I work with high achievers by definition. These are people doing stuff, right? They're unlocking their next level. And
Mm,
so
mm,
they're often very self-critical because they have a very high standard for themselves. And I really relate to this. I mean, this is how I am too.
right.
And I think your point about as a leader, don't go into immediately, how did this happen? Start with forward looking. I think the same is really important for ourselves. It's not that we don't want to
Yes.
acknowledge, like, you know what, I screwed that up. But in the initial response, it's, oh, well, I'm so glad I'm aware of this. Okay, what can I
Yep.
learn going forward? I love the
Right.
separation in time. Like later you can, because I think
Yes.
I see so many people, Amy, fall into, and again, this is something I have to work on. We start the self recrimination, like, oh my God, I screwed this up. And then that actually prevents us from trying again.
Absolutely. Because what you start to internalize um, the mentality that it's better not to take risks, right? You start to play not to lose rather than play to win. Um, it's and it's so much, it's you can even look like you're really successful, but that you're holding back, that you're setting the targets lower, that you're only participating in the sports you can win. And then ultimately that's depriving you of of growth and learning and even adventure and even success.
Yeah, I think that's actually, you set the target low enough so that you're not disappointed if you can't reach
Yeah,
higher, right? But if we learn how to intelligently fail, then we're not as scared of it.
exactly. And psychologists call that, or at least one word for that phenomenon is self-handicapping, right? I'm just going to,
Mm,
I'm
okay.
not going to allow myself to go for it, to aim high. And
That's a
then I
good
won't
term.
be disappointed. I won't be
Yeah.
disappointed if I don't get there.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things I connected to this, I want to tell you when I read this line, I'm not going to look for the page, but when you talk about in your book, okay, we just need to accept that we're all fallible, vulnerable human beings. And I don't know what it was about that, Amy. It's like obvious, but when I read that, it was like, oh,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
okay, all of
Well,
us, this is who we are. Can you talk about that and how we can all internalize that more in a
yeah.
practical, like day-to-day way?
Yes, I mean, I think it's to me. I had the same reaction when a psychiatrist who worked with the company that I was working with at the time introduced that term to us. Fallible human being, just a FHB for short, right? It's like, oh, I mean, I think the initial thing is that deep sense of I'm not alone. I mean, you're fallible. you know, Probably your team members know you're fallible, but sometimes they don't know that you know. So that's part of it. Right? So part of it is just that deep sense of this is actually what connects us. The difference between an acquaintance and a friend is where
Hmm.
you sort of drop some of the pretense, some of the, putting on the good face so that they will think you are smart or capable or important or whatever. You start making a friend when you start sharing your fears, your weaknesses, the things you maybe don't feel so good about that you might have done. I mean, then that you're letting them in, and when you let them in, suddenly the bond is so real, and you've gone beyond the sort of the superficial impression management stage to actually connect.
And I think that's so, like like as you're saying this, I'm sure the listeners are like, yeah, of course. Like we know this, but we
Yeah,
forget,
we
right? Like
forget.
we know that this
Yeah.
is it's like, I often say in my keynotes, like, think of the stories that you tend to tell. The person next to you on a plane or your we don't tell stories of when everything was amazing. That's boring. We tell stories of times we screwed up or things
It's
didn't work
true.
out. Like it's our connective tissue. But
That's
it's so
right.
easy to forget. I think there was a big insight in what you just said about the team. It's, I know that I'm fallible as a human being. Maybe the team knows, but letting them know that I know. And that I
Exactly.
think this
Close
goes
that
in
gap. No,
friendship.
it's profound, right? It's
Yeah,
it's truly
it's
profound
huge.
because otherwise we're all in this charade here,
Yeah.
of kind of showing off or trying to look good, which takes up a lot of energy, frankly. And rather than just being real. And
Yeah.
we think people will like us more if we're perfect, when in reality we like people more when they're imperfect. Not because they're human, and we have this more genuine connection.
That's right. Because of like the premise, the foundational like thesis, we're all vulnerable, imperfect human beings. So when we drop the facade,
Right,
it's like, oh,
right.
she's for real. And I think this is so important. One of the things again that I work with a lot with leaders on, and myself, when people get paralyzed by doubt. I'm sure you've encountered executive like the most, and one of the mistakes we make is we think if someone's successful and accomplished, they don't have doubt. I actually
Yeah.
find the absolute opposite correlation. And I just wonder, Amy, from all this work around failure and mistakes you've done, like what would be your advice if someone, like they acknowledge they're paralyzed by doubt, or maybe they hear this
Yeah.
conversation, but they're still in a place of like, I don't know, I would rather not. I would rather not go for that interview or launch that. I can't do it. I don't think I have what it takes.
I think first of all, it's the old, it's related to the imposter syndrome, right? And as you implied just a minute ago, it's particularly high achievers are particularly vulnerable to this, which is either ironic or puzzling or something. But I think what the very first thing is just know that you're not alone, right? Know that virtually everyone else is having some variation of the same experience of that, that doubt, that anxiety, that worry, that things, we look ahead and things might not work out, or I might not be I might not reach the various things I'm trying to reach.
Hmm.
So you're not alone. You're actually better off when you come from a place where you're willing to be more honest and transparent about it. And actually, you never know where that, that missing piece might come from, right? When you're honest about your goals, about, here's how I think about it, but here's what I might be missing, people will step up and give you the missing pieces sometimes. So it's like you're not only is there the emotional reward of knowing you're not alone, of connecting with other people in a more real and transparent way, which is inherently, um, meaningful and enjoyable, but also practically, you will often get some of the missing pieces that you were looking for, whether in, ideas or support or just, cheering you on or what have you. So, I think the more, it's like people think of vulnerable as equivalent to the word weak. It's not. I mean, vulnerable is just really about being more honest about what lies ahead. I mean, we're all vulnerable, which means we're all at risk of uncertainty and harm. And we are better off and, more likely to come out on top if we're clear-eyed about that and honest about that.
Honest about it. One of the other aspects, at least, than what I've learned and what I share is one of the most powerful antidotes to getting paralyzed by doubt is starting to take some action, right?
Yes.
Just starting and the more we talk, the more the connection I'm making is the more action we take, the more feedback we get. And the more feedback we get, the more confident we feel, because we are some unicorn now that nothing bad can happen to, but we know the lay of the land. We're like, oh, I have feedback. This direction,
we're like a scientist who has more data. They will be more effective, more successful than a scientist who has less data. And it's a really important point. I mean, I argue in the book, we think of successful people as those who, just have not had failures. But the reality is that successful people in any industry or domain, whether it's, business or, elite athletics or celebrity chefs or whatever, the ones who come out on top have had literally more failures. I'm not saying higher percentage, but they have objectively had more failures than, the average person in their field.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories from the book that I didn't know about is what is her first name? But the widow of the champagne,
Barb Nicole. Yes.
Can you just share a little bit of that story? I'd never heard of it. I found it very inspiring.
And I got it from a wonderful book about Barb Nicole Ponsardin was her maiden name. She became Barb Nicole Clicquot. She married in her early 20s. She married Francois Clicquot. Both the two families were both in textiles, and they were, this. Oh, by the way, this is like the late 1700s.
Yeah.
So very, very long time ago. But these two young people had a dream. They lived in the Champagne region. They had a dream of starting a wine business, and that's not an easy thing to do. But off they went, and turns out making wine is quite hard. And at the time, champagne, it wasn't even the beautiful, clear liquid we know today. It was a very different beverage. But in fact, Barb Nicole came up with some of the sort of technical innovation that led to the clarity of champagne that we know today. Nonetheless, it is a story, and I won't go on and on, but it is a story of a woman entrepreneur who, with a dream. Then her young husband died at the age of 26 of the flu, and she's left alone. Of course, everybody assumes she will now go, and it's not the business hasn't by no means gotten successful yet. Right? They're still muddling around trying to make it work. Bad harvest, some exploding bottles in the cargo of a ship. I mean, everything is going wrong, and everyone expected after her husband died that she would then go back and sort of just resign into a more domestic existence, and that she was determined to continue and the dream, and she did, and she ends up being. I mean, this is an iconic brand, Veuve Clicquot, which means widow Clicquot, which is the one of the great business stories of longevity and success. So
Mhm.
champagne, of course, we often use to celebrate successes like
Yes.
graduations and weddings and so forth. So it's a, but what I like about the story, she's obviously, she ends up being a, and she dies in like very, very old lady. But she's successful, not in, in spite of repeated failures along the way, technology, agricultural
War.
marketing,
There's
wars
war
breaking
going on.
out,
Yes.
disrupting markets and all the rest. But perhaps even you could say it because of the
Hmm.
repeated failures. I mean, again, the more failures, the more learning, ultimately the more success.
Yeah, I really, and that's what I took away from that story is not, and I'm sure if we went back in time and asked her in the midst of it,
Oh,
she wouldn't say it's a pleasant, wonderful, oh yeah,
no.
this is fantastic. And I think that's the other thing. One of the things I really took away from your book is just to zoom out a little bit, the time horizon that we give ourselves.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I think part of the self-discipline of learning from failure means the ability to step back and put a bigger time horizon onto the story, because
Yeah.
in the moment it feels awful, and the way to improve that emotional experience is to force yourself to step back, and try to put it in context, and in the context of a business or a life or a project, the chances are that it's not really the end of the world.
Very few things are the end of the world. Do you have a favorite intelligent failure of yours, Amy, or any failure? What's your, I'm sure you get
Well,
this, but what's your
I, you
favorite
know,
one?
I mean, my favorite, I have many because I'm a researcher. So that means, anytime I do a research project and I write up the results and I submit that paper to, say, a top journal and it gets rejected, that's a failure for sure. It's intelligent because it's not knowable in advance, and it's like aiming high, doing my best. And, the majority of papers get rejected the first time. If you're lucky, you get something called a reject and resubmit. And then you have to work really hard on it. And maybe they'll take it the second time, maybe they won't. But so there's lots of failure in a research career. My favorite failure story is the one that I opened the book with. It's the prologue of the book, and it is a story about a research project that I did I was a second year PhD student, where I had data, team effectiveness data from some hospital patient care teams, and independently trained medical investigators were gathering data, kind of by going unit to unit on errors, medical adverse drug
Mhm.
events, and medical errors. And my hypothesis was that better teamwork, according to a validated team survey instrument, would lead to fewer error rates. And then, unfortunately, or at least initially, unfortunately, the data suggested the exact opposite. Not, you want a correlation, but this correlation was significant, statistically significant, but in the wrong direction. Right? So the data were saying better teams, according to the survey, had higher, not lower, error rates. So I was, in a mild state of despair, ultimately confusion, because it's like, wait a minute, this doesn't make
Yeah,
sense.
does make sense.
And it was disappointing. And I mean, the initial unhealthy reaction is, God, I'm going to never make it as a researcher, and I'm going to have to drop out of graduate school. And what do I do next? Whatever, whatever. Not healthy thinking. Um, and then within the same day, I started to at least ask the question of like, why, what happened? Why might this, what might explain this unexpected relationship? And that's when it occurred to me that maybe these were not competence differences, not actual error differences,
Mhm.
but speaking up differences, right? That maybe the sort of better teams were more willing to report the bad news, right? And if that was true, it had, first of all, it had real implications for the ability in hospitals and other organizations to learn from error, because you can't learn from errors that you don't know about. So I started thinking about that. If that's a real phenomenon, and particularly, it's obviously a phenomenon that people don't like to talk about mistakes, but the weird part of it was that there could be differences across groups in willingness to speak up. And that was the one that I thought, well, wait a minute, that's interesting, right? Because it's the same corporate culture, et cetera, but why there are these local differences in interpersonal climate. And
Yeah.
that insight, which took a lot more work to sort of test the plausibility of, but that insight became, ultimately turned into a very like robust and large literature on psychological safety as a
Yes.
property of teams that predicts learning and performance in teams.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted you to share that story is I'd heard you talk about it before I'd read it, because I talk about you and psychological safety in a lot of the work that I do with leaders. But I think it's such a beautiful example of how, in the short term, that was a
Oh,
failure.
yeah,
You
right,
submitted a paper, you had a hypothesis, the hypothesis was wrong, the paper is rejected. So if we just look at it in that time frame, sucks, bad.
right. It
But
sucks.
actually, that failure, your learning lens on that failure. So you responding not with,
Exactly.
oh my God, I'm terrible. My researchers are terrible. Everyone's terrible. The hospitals we did but you asking, well, this is interesting. What can I
Yeah.
learn from this? Actually led you, Amy, like psychological safety. That is what you became known for initially. Like that was your giant contribution that continues
It's true. It's true. I
once
mean,
you extended the time horizon and
if
responded with a learning lens.
exactly. I mean, sorry to, yeah, it's
Yeah.
if I hadn't had that failure, let's say, the data had been clean and I was able to show that, it would have been an uninteresting paper. And I never would have had this, insight that led me to then pursue something else that, as you say, ended up being quite successful.
And important, not just successful for you, but really important for all of us. I just want to share with you when I was reading your book, I was thinking for this interview, rereading some of my favorite parts. I was thinking about it. I just want to share with you and the listeners. I last year, so I've written a couple books, 3 books. And last year I was like, okay, I have this idea for another book. And to write a book, we have to write a proposal. And I like poured myself into it 6 months. And then I sent it to my publisher, and they're one I have a great relationship. So I sent it, I say, here's my next book proposal. And I had this really weird feeling like the day after. It was this, I don't know, I couldn't put a finger on it. It was odd. I wasn't like enthusiastic. I'm generally a very
Huh.
enthusiastic person.
Yeah.
So I get on a call with them a few weeks later, and I can see Jamie, she's the publisher. I can see her face. I know her. Not doing it. She's not doing the usual,
It's
oh,
a failure. It's a
that's
failure,
right.
right? It's
And
a
I get
disappointment.
on and she's like, yeah, Natalie, I just didn't, I didn't feel you in it. I'm not sure about this topic. And we had a really honest conversation. And I said, okay, got it. And I went back, had unhealthy reaction for a while. Oh my God, I'm so stupid. I'll never write another book. My publisher hates me, all this stuff. And then I started to ask myself, well, that's interesting. Why did she feel the topic didn't connect with me? Like, what was she? And then I said, what was that feeling I was having? And the answer, it took me a while, like you. I was like, I don't really want to write on this topic. This
Yeah.
is a topic I thought I should write about, but not
Right.
the topic I'm passionate about. And understanding that, as much as it sucked and felt terrible, because I was like, I just spent a year.
Right.
That actually then asking myself the question, what do I really like? What am I really excited to explore next? Brought me to this concept of reinventability, which is my
Wow.
definition of it is
Wow.
reinventability is this capacity we all have to take action to create the future we envision. Right.
Wow.
And I was
Yeah.
like, oh, so it brought me to this concept, which then
God,
like my whole new body of work, my keynotes, this podcast, my leadership training, possibly a new book came from a failure of a book
isn't
proposal.
that great? It's so great. No, because I mean, I cringe how often this happens in life, certainly to me, where there's a part of you maybe deep down that's like, I'm not sure my heart's really in it, or I'm not sure this is really the best new thing or whatever. And then you bring it forward, you bring the proposal forward. And what if she had said, great, go do it? You then would spend like a year and a half of your life, and that would be the failure, right? The sort of so-called rejection of the proposal was not the failure. That unleashed you, to actually do the next thing. So it's
And I
such a
think
good
that's,
story. I love
yeah, and
that.
I think that's a great point, Amy, also it's a great thing to wrap on. Like, that's another great thing to think about. Like, I'd love for your insight on like failure, like it's an undesired outcome. But if we
Right.
really think about like, what is really important to me? Like, and is it important to me that my publisher says yes and publishes this book? Or is it
Right.
really
Right.
important to me that I do work that I'm excited about that is actually aligned, right? So I think it's also,
Absolutely.
isn't it asking ourselves that question?
Yeah. So I think it's what is really important to me. And I believe that we've just discovered something here because I believe it's also the time thing, right?
Hmm.
It's, it feels, it just, we're trained to think of that as a failure, that a rejection, that was an undesired outcome. I put this nice little thing together. You rejected it. It doesn't feel good. And when you force yourself to back up and put it in a larger picture, you and connect it to what really matters, your real goals, not just look good and write new books, but to really make an impact on a particular issue. So I think it's the reconnecting with the values, purpose, and putting it in the time into a larger time context, and that is a self-discipline, like to just force yourself to step back, like Powers of 10, that old movie, and see it. Okay, this is just a speck,
Hmm.
in a longer time frame, and it's actually a gift to have learned here and now rather than poured more time and energy into it.
Yeah, and you're right in your book, about Daniel Pink's research on regret. I'm thinking about it as you talk. Like, what would I regret more 10 years from now? Would I regret that book coming out and taking me on a long journey? Because not just writing the book,
Oh, I
marketing the
know.
book, would I regret that more and constantly feeling like I don't want to be doing this?
Yes.
Or would I regret the opposite, which is like,
Right.
oh, I learned, let me do. I think that's a regret is a powerful, I think regret in a way gives us that perspective.
I completely agree. I completely agree.
Yeah.
And it's what Dan Pink finds is that people are more likely to regret the risks they didn't take than
Yes.
to the setbacks and failures that they did experience. And I think that's a really
Yes.
important
Yeah,
lesson.
it's a great reminder. Amy, I could talk to you for hours. Thank you so much for making time for your insights. I know you have lots of fans. I just want to tell you your work, starting with psychological safety, and I read that original paper on the
Wow.
nurses because I've done a lot of work with hospitals. Especially during the pandemic, and your work has been a big influence on me and my work and how I parent. And this book was a gift. So thank you for you and for sharing your insights so openly, for making the time. I really, really appreciate you.
Thank you. It was a joy speaking with you today.
Yeah, and thank you to our listener and those of you watching. Appreciate you being with us, and I will see you or be in your ear for our next episode.